Welcome to the 21st Century Men podcast. This is where we take a really close look, a deep dive, into the book, The 21st Century Man by Dr. Judson Brandeis.
That's right.
Our idea here is simple. Go chapter by chapter, pull out the core messages, cut through, the noise, and find the really valuable stuff for navigating life today.
Exactly.
And today, we're turning to chapter 48. This one tackles a topic that's just, everywhere these days, and there's a lot of concern around it. Cannabis.
Yeah, it's definitely a big topic. And this deep dive specifically is about what Dr. Brandeis calls the dark side of cannabis in this chapter. We're sticking strictly to the information provided in the source material you gave us for this chapter.
Right.
Our goal is to sort of unpack the key facts, maybe some surprising findings, and definitely the crucial takeaways about the risks and complexities tied to cannabis use, all based on what's in this chapter.
And the chapter really doesn't pull any punches right from the start. It kicks off with this incredibly arresting personal story from the author. It sets a really dramatic, kind of concerning tone immediately.
It really does.
He talks about getting a call at like 1 a.m. He's a urologist, so he knows those late calls are usually serious.
Mm-hmm.
This one was from the ER at a local trauma center. It was about a young man, 20 years old, who had tried to seriously harm himself.
Just a terrible situation.
Yeah.
Dr. Brandeis talks about rushing to the hospital, performing surgery, and then afterwards, he's in the lobby and he runs into the young man's father.
Okay.
And it turns out the father was actually an old patient of his. And the father just confided in him, talking about his son's struggles. Specifically, he mentioned heavy cannabis use and how it seemed to be, triggering these severe schizophrenic episodes. It's a really powerful and quite heartbreaking way to start this discussion.
It is, but here's where it gets interesting regarding the author's own process writing this. He actually admits that his initial thinking was maybe, that marijuana wasn't quite as bad a drug as he'd thought before. But the story, this really tragic incident with the young man, it pushed him towards a different kind of conclusion for that specific case. He realized the severity was probably down to something much more dangerous: street cannabis that had been laced.
Right. That's a huge distinction.
Exactly. And he shares this right up front. It sets up this fundamental difference that the chapter then dives into the difference between the plant and what you might actually be getting on the street.
And what's so effective about starting that way is how that very personal, frankly shocking story leads directly into one of the major public health issues the chapter covers. The huge problem with unregulated street cannabis.
Yeah.
His research for the chapter showed it's actually alarmingly common for street cannabis, just weed, to be contaminated or intentionally mixed with much more addictive, much more damaging substances.
Okay, we really need to dig into this because the implications are just terrifying. The chapter names names. It lists drugs found lacing street weed. Things like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, PCP, even LSD.
Yeah, these aren't minor things. These are seriously potent, dangerous drugs, each with its own massive list of risks.
Absolutely.
And the source material is specific about the damage. It mentions PCP, or angel dust. The chapter flat out says PCP is very damaging to the brain, and it notes the damage is actually visible on an MRI scan.
Wow. Visible on an MRI.
Yeah. Just think about that. You think you're using cannabis, but you could be getting this unknown additive that's causing observable physical damage to your brain. That's just a staggering level of hidden risk in the unregulated market.
And methamphetamine gets called out too, right?
It does. The chapter points out its strong link to symptoms that look like schizophrenia.
Yeah.
It even says that for about 40% of meth users, these psychotic episodes are so common they actually have a name for it: meth psychosis.
40%, that's huge.
It is. And this brings up a really critical point the chapter explores. If street weed is often laced with stuff like meth, which we know can trigger psychosis, then how much of the dark side people blame on cannabis itself is actually the result of these hidden, dangerous additives?
That's a really important question.
And the source makes a direct link here. It says, cannabis laced with these more addictive drugs becomes a gateway drug. So it reframes that whole debate.
Right. It's not necessarily the cannabis itself chemically leading to harder stuff.
Exactly. It might be the involuntary exposure to highly addictive, damaging drugs smuggled into the product without the user even knowing. That's what could be creating the pathway.
So when we're trying to understand the risks, this is huge. It means a massive part, maybe the most devastating part, of the immediate danger might not be from cannabis's known effects, but from this completely uncontrolled criminal supply chain adding these incredibly harmful things.
Precisely. That distinction, which the chapter really emphasizes, is just crucial for anyone trying to get a handle on the real dark side of cannabis as it exists on the street. It's not just the plant, it's the potentially lethal risks from an unchecked production process.
And connecting this back, understanding this risk from lacing is so important because, well, cannabis use is just incredibly widespread, isn't it, globally and here in the U.S.?
It really is.
Yeah.
The chapter gives us some context on that. It reminds us cannabis, or marijuana, is one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances on the planet.
And the numbers cited in the source really drive that home. The World Health Organization says 147 million people use it worldwide. That's almost 3% of everyone on Earth.
Wow.
Then closer to home, a 2019 Gallup poll mentioned in the chapter found 12% of Americans smoke cannabis.
12%. Okay.
And here's a demographic detail from California that surprised me, also from the source. A quarter, 25%, of cannabis consumers there are baby boomers, so age 50 plus.
That is interesting. It really spans the generations.
It does.
And these numbers aren't just, trivia. They really underline why this topic matters so much. When millions of people across the globe, across generations, are using a substance, understanding all the potential risks, especially hidden ones like lacing or the other impacts the chapter details, it just becomes a major public health issue. So for you, the listener, these stats just show why digging into this chapter of the 21st Century Man is so relevant. It affects a huge number of lives. We need to be informed.
So the chapter then kind of logically moves into the three main areas of public health concern it focuses on. We've hit one hard already, the immediate harm from potentially laced street cannabis. But there are two other big ones the chapter wants us to consider.
That's right. So beyond the lacing risk, the three primary concerns identified in the source are: Number 1, the significant risk of car accidents while impaired by cannabis.
Okay.
Number 2, the risks of laced street cannabis, which we've discussed. And number 3, the kind of concerning and still not fully understood effects of cannabis use on adolescents, particularly their developing brains.
Right. Let's start with that first one, the risk of auto accidents. The chapter calls this an immediate harm, and it's very specific about how cannabis impairs driving.
Yeah, it slows reaction time, obviously crucial for driving.
Crucial.
It also messes with concentration, short-term memory, your ability to assess risk, and just general judgment. The chapter draws a direct parallel to alcohol impairment, saying it hits many of the same cognitive skills needed to drive safely.
And it backs this up with data, right? Specific studies.
It does. And the data is compelling. It mentions a big Norwegian study looked at over 90,000 drivers. That study found cannabis intoxication was linked to a significant jump in accident risk, 28% higher.
28%. That's not insignificant.
Not at all, especially when you think about millions of drivers. And it gets worse when you mix substances. The chapter points to a Yale study.
Okay.
That one found mixing marijuana and alcohol leads to impairment that's way worse than either one alone. The study said impairment happened even at doses which would normally be insignificant if you just had the alcohol or just the cannabis. It's a synergistic effect. The combination is much riskier than just adding the two risks together.
That's a really important warning, the combined effect.
Definitely. And this leads to another tricky aspect the source highlights with a French study. This one found something particularly worrying, especially for people who don't use cannabis often.
What's that?
A delayed onset of the euphoria and the impairment. It was apparently more pronounced in occasional users.
Delayed onset. Okay, I can see how that would be dangerous.
Exactly. The French study found that drivers, especially occasional users, would smoke, wait a while, feel okay, and think they were fine to drive hours later.
Right, because they didn't feel it hit them right away.
Precisely. They felt fine, but underneath, this delayed effect was kicking in, subtly messing with their reaction time, their concentration, their judgment. They thought they were safe to drive, but their abilities were compromised in ways they just didn't perceive at that moment.
Wow. That's incredibly dangerous from a safety standpoint. The impairment is kind of hidden, creeping up on you.
Yeah, exactly. Latent impairment. And this finding ties directly into one of the key takeaways listed at the end of the chapter. It states drivers using cannabis are 2 to 7 times more likely to be responsible for accidents.
2 to 7 times?
Yeah, depending on the THC level consumed. So Considering this potential for delayed effects, the chapter strongly implies, and this is a key actionable takeaway for you, the listener, just don't drive after consuming cannabis. The risk is higher, it can be unpredictable in timing, and it's massively amplified if you mix it with alcohol.
Okay, so that's the driving risk. And just to circle back quickly before we move on, the chapter really hammers home the risk of laced street drugs as another major immediate harm. You mentioned the potential effects: psychosis, visible brain injury like with PCP, even fatal overdoses from unknown stuff. It's worth repeating just how severe that immediate risk is, tied directly to the unregulated market.
Absolutely. It's a risk tied entirely to the source of the product, with potentially catastrophic results. So that brings us to the third main area of concern the chapter explores: the effects on adolescents. This one covers both long-term developmental risks and maybe immediate harms during that critical brain growth period.
Yeah, this feels like one of the heaviest findings in the chapter, especially if you're a parent or work with young people. The core issue, the source says, is the impact on the teenage brain while it's still developing.
Right, and the chapter points to a very specific, well-known study from New Zealand to illustrate this.
What did that find?
Well, this study followed people for years. It specifically looked at those who started smoking marijuana heavily as teenagers and then developed an ongoing cannabis use disorder into adulthood. The finding was pretty stark, actually quite alarming.
Okay.
This group lost, on average, 8 IQ points between the ages of 13 and 38.
8 points, that's significant.
Yeah, it is. And here's the absolutely crucial contrast the chapter makes, underlining the unique vulnerability here. People in the study who started smoking as adults did not show those kinds of IQ declines over the same time.
So it really points to the age of starting heavy use as the key factor.
It strongly suggests that yes. The implication, as the chapter discusses, is that the developing adolescent brain seems uniquely vulnerable to the negative cognitive impacts of heavy ongoing cannabis exposure in a way the adult brain isn't, at least not regarding IQ loss in this particular study.
And did those lost points come back if they quit?
That's another critical finding. The study found that the lost mental abilities in that teenage onset group didn't fully return, even for those who stopped using marijuana later as adults.
Wow.
Which suggests the impact during that formative period might be long-lasting, perhaps even permanent, or at least very hard to recover from fully.
So the takeaway here for you, the listener, especially if you're young or know young people, is really profound. This isn't just about temporary effects. The chapter points to the possibility of significant, long-term, maybe irreversible impacts on core thinking skills, learning, memory, problem-solving, if heavy use starts during those teenage years. It really explains why the chapter flags adolescent use as a distinct and major public health concern.
Definitely. And beyond that specific IQ finding, the chapter also talks about other potential long-term risks, like cannabis use disorder.
Right. How does the source define that?
It gives some key signs of overuse. Things like impaired functioning at work or school, a noticeable lack of motivation, sometimes called amotivational syndrome, giving up activities you used to enjoy because of cannabis use, and linking back again the dangers of driving while high.
Yeah.
The chapter suggests developing this disorder probably involves both genetic factors and social influences.
And what about treating it?
Well, the chapter outlines the main approaches, usually psychosocial stuff like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or motivational enhancement therapy. But here's a major challenge it points out. If those therapies aren't enough for someone to stop or cut back, the chapter explicitly states that no medication has been proven effective for cannabis overuse.
Really? No medication at all?
According to this source, no.
Okay.
Which makes treating it potentially more challenging than, say, alcohol or opioid dependency, where medications can play a bigger role alongside therapy. I mean, behavioral and psychological support are really the main tools available based on this chapter's information. It highlights a bit of a gap in treatment options.
And the chapter also mentions broader unknown effects on emotions, memory, and learning, right? Suggesting there might be more going on beyond just the IQ thing with teens.
Yes, exactly. It suggests that while the IQ drop seems linked to heavy teen use, there could be other cognitive or emotional impacts from long-term use more generally that are still being studied. So the research into long-term effects, even in adults, is definitely ongoing.
Okay. So, moving into the science side of things, the chapter gives some background on the chemistry and how cannabis interacts with our bodies. This is where the endocannabinoid system comes in.
Precisely. The discovery of this system back in 1992 really changed how science viewed cannabis. Researchers found these specific receptors, called CB1 and CB2, all through our brains and bodies.
Okay.
And this revealed that our own bodies actually make compounds very similar to those in cannabis, and we have this whole built-in system, the endocannabinoid system, designed to interact with them. It kind of normalized the idea that cannabis compounds aren't just foreign substances, they plug into an existing biological system.
Interesting. So our bodies have their own version.
They do. The chapter explains there are three main forms of these compounds.
Yeah.
First, the ones our bodies make are natural endocannabinoids. They act like neurotransmitters, helping regulate things like mood, pain, memory, appetite.
Okay. And
Second, the plant-based ones, found naturally in the hemp family, especially cannabis sativa. And the source adds that interesting historical bit, used as medicine for over 1,000 years, used ritually for maybe 3,000 years, found in ancient burial sites. It's a very long human history with this plant.
Fascinating. And the third form?
Synthetic cannabinoids. These are molecules made in labs that also bind to those same receptors. They could be pharmaceutical drugs developed for medical use, or they can be synthesized illicitly for recreational purposes. The chapter does note these synthetic recreational ones can sometimes have different, maybe more intense effects and risks than the plant stuff.
Got it. And the chapter clearly separates THC and CBD, the two main compounds people talk about.
Yes. THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the one identified as the primary psychoactive component. That's what causes the high, and the source says THC concentration is how potency is measured.
Right. And CBD?
CBD, cannabidiol, is described as the major non-psychoactive part. Its effects are listed as different, promoting relaxation, sleep, improving appetite, reducing pain and inflammation. So very different from THC's psychoactive effects. This distinction is key and actually hints at the topic of our next deep dive, which the book covers in the following chapter, the health benefits of CBD.
Ah, okay, good connection. So back to recreational use for now. The chapter points out something really significant, how much stronger cannabis has gotten over the years.
Yeah, that's a major factor. The potency has increased dramatically. The source notes back in the 60s, THC levels are pretty low, maybe 1% to 5%.
Yeah, that low.
Yeah, but today, standard plant-based cannabis is more like 5% to 12% THC. That's a big jump.
And straight stuff is even higher.
Often, yes. The chapter says street cannabis today typically ranges from 15% to 20% THC. And then you have concentrates like hashish or hash oil, which can be anywhere from 20% up to a massive 80% THC.
80%.
Yeah. So this huge increase in potency means the effects and potentially the risks of using cannabis today could be quite different, maybe more intense than decades ago, even from the same type of plant. It's a really critical piece of context for understanding current concerns.
And what about the actual effects people experience? The chapter describes those too, right?
It does. It lists the commonly reported subjective effects, feeling euphoric, pleasurable, less anxious or tense. It can also change perception. Colors seem brighter, music sounds more vivid, sense of time and space can get distorted. Some people report things like mystical thinking or feeling like their consciousness is expanded.
Sounds quite varied.
It is. And the source stresses these responses are really individual. While many might get those effects, it notes some people can experience temporary paranoia even with the same product. So how one person reacts can be quite different from another.
Okay. And does it explain how THC causes the high?
Briefly, yes. It says THC mainly activates those CB1 receptors we talked about, which are all over the brain. Activating them boosts the release of dopamine, part of the brain's reward system, contributing to the euphoria.
Makes sense.
The source also notes that with chronic, regular use, those CB1 receptors can become less sensitive, which might slightly reduce the effects over time. But importantly, if someone stops using, that sensitivity comes back relatively quickly, often within days.
And how you consume it matters too, right? Smoking versus edibles.
Big difference. Smoking or vaping brings on effects very fast, within minutes. Peak effects are usually 15 to 30 minutes later, and the whole thing lasts maybe up to 4 hours.
Okay. And edibles?
Much slower.
Mm.
Because it has to be digested, effects don't usually kick in for 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours. The effects also tend to last longer, 3 or 4 hours, maybe more. And the chapter flags a specific danger with edibles, especially for people who aren't used to them.
What's that danger?
It's that delayed onset again. Because you don't feel anything right away, it's really tempting to eat more, thinking the first dose wasn't enough or didn't work.
Ah, the classic mistake.
Exactly. So you end up taking a much bigger dose than you meant to. Then, when it all finally hits, it can be really uncomfortable, overly intense, maybe even cause nausea or vomiting. It's apparently a very common issue for novices.
Good warning. The chapter also mentions synthetic cannabinoids briefly, saying they are different.
Yeah, it contrasts them with plant-based cannabis. It notes synthetics are often linked to a more intense, longer-lasting high.
Yeah.
And importantly, the source says synthetic cannabinoids seem to have a withdrawal syndrome, which suggests a different kind of dependency risk compared to what's usually seen with plant-based cannabis. It just reinforces that not all things hitting those receptors are the same.
Right. What about intoxication? Does the chapter say much about serious cases or ER visits?
It actually states that serious cannabis intoxication needing medical help is relatively rare in adolescents and adults. When adults do seek treatment, it's often for what's described as mild intoxication, with dysphoria, basically feeling uneasy or generally unwell.
Okay. And how is that usually handled?
The chapter says mild cases are typically managed with simple supportive care. A quiet, dimly lit room, reassurance, reducing stimulation. Sometimes a mild sedative like a benzodiazepine might be used for anxiety or agitation.
And mention some stats from Colorado after legalization.
It did. It showed ER visits related to cannabis overuse peaked in 2014, around when recreational sales started, hitting just over 1,000 visits per 100,000 ER visits overall.
Okay, a spike then.
Yeah, but the chapter also notes a rate drop the next year, 2015, down to about 750 per 100K visits.
Interesting. So maybe an initial adjustment period.
Could be. Perhaps related to people figuring out dosage, especially with edibles. The source presents the data as part of the picture of public health impact post-legalization in that state, but interpreting trends needs care.
Got it. And finally, on the science side, metabolism and testing. How does that work?
Drug tests for THC are usually urine tests. And the really important thing the chapter highlights here is how THC is stored. It's fat-soluble, lipophilic, so it builds up in body fat. It means it can stay detectable in your blood or urine for a long time, sometimes weeks after you last used it, especially if you use regularly. So a positive test doesn't automatically mean you were impaired recently. It just confirms past use.
That's a really key point for interpreting tests.
Absolutely. The chapter mentions the liver breaks down THC using the CYP450 enzyme system, and it's excreted mostly in feces, about 2/3, and the rest in urine, about 1/3.
Okay. So after covering all these risks and the science, the chapter then shifts a bit, doesn't it? It looks at potential medical uses.
It does. It provides that counterpoint, discussing potential medical applications backed by research. It mentions the historical use in Europe for various conditions, reminding us it has a long history as a medicine, not just recreational use.
What kind of conditions does it mention?
Things like supporting AIDS treatment, helping manage addiction issues, supportive care during cancer therapy, controlling severe nausea and vomiting, managing certain seizure disorders, and dealing with severe chronic pain. The chapter notes there's been quite a bit of research, over 400 clinical trials worldwide looking into medical cannabis.
400 trials. So where has research actually shown it might be effective, according to the source?
The source lists several areas: anxiety and what it calls reactive depression, but it specifically says not treatment-resistant depression, also potentially helping with high blood pressure and maybe some lung conditions like asthma, COPD, chronic bronchitis.
Okay. Any neurological conditions?
Yes, it lists several: multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, PTSD, and Tourette syndrome as areas where research suggests potential benefits.
And it seemed to focus quite a bit on pain management.
It did. It explained how it might help there. By reducing chronic pain levels, it could allow patients to manage their pain with lower doses of opioid medications.
Ah, the opioid sparing effect.
Exactly. And that's presented as a huge potential benefit because using less opioids significantly cuts down the risk of opioid overuse, addiction, and overdose, which we know is a massive crisis.
Right.
The source mentions specific studies finding it helpful for fibromyalgia pain and migraines. It also notes benefits for reducing inflammation, which often goes with chronic pain, and helping with insomnia, which is common for people in pain or with anxiety.
So, putting it all together, the chapter isn't just a doom and gloom picture. It presents the serious risks, the dark side, but it also acknowledges the research-backed potential medical uses. It gives a more balanced, nuanced perspective.
Absolutely. It aims for that complexity, presenting both sides based on the available evidence cited in the source.
Which brings us nicely to summarizing the main takeaways, the really essential points the chapter wants us to remember.
Okay. First one, clearly stated. THC is the main psychoactive part, and it's how potency is measured.
Got it. Second.
Cannabis testing is usually urine-based, and because THC stores in fat, it can show up for weeks after use. Crucial for interpreting results.
Right. Third, the driving aspect. Cannabis impairs driving, slows reaction time, messes with concentration. Very important safety message.
Definitely. And linked to that, the chapter's stark statistic. Drivers using cannabis are 2 to 7 times more likely to cause accidents, depending on the THC level.
2 to 7 times. That's a huge range, but clearly significant.
Massive. And then, beyond those explicitly listed takeaways, our discussion pulled out other critical points from the chapter. The potentially devastating risks of laced street drugs.
Absolutely terrifying.
That specific, very concerning finding about IQ loss and heavy teenage users versus adults.
Highlighting that developmental vulnerability.
And the existence of cannabis use disorder, with its treatment challenges, especially the lack of medication options noted in the source.
Right, so wrapping this all up, what have we really learned from digging into Chapter 48 of The 21st Century Man?
Well, we've taken a pretty thorough look at what the author terms the dark side of cannabis. We've seen serious immediate risks, especially from unregulated street products and impaired driving. We've explored the really concerning potential long-term impact on developing brains, contrasted with adult use. And we've balanced all that with potential medical applications that research supports. It really shows just how complex this substance is.
And I have to say, the way Dr. Brandeis handles a topic like this one that's often so polarized, by sticking to data, specific research, acknowledging both the major risks and the potential benefits, it's really commendable.
I agree.
The depth in just this one chapter really speaks to the value of The 21st Century Man as a whole resource for understanding these complicated health and social issues.
Absolutely. And if this deep dive has maybe opened your eyes to some nuances or critical details about cannabis you hadn't thought about, we definitely encourage you to read the book, The 21st Century Man, for yourself. Getting the full context directly from the source really helps build a deeper understanding of this and, honestly, so many other topics that are just crucial for navigating modern life for men and really for anyone interested in health and well-being today.
Well said. So as we finish up, here's that thought-provoking question drawn straight from the material we've discussed for you, the listener, to chew on. Given that stark difference, the chapter highlights the impact of heavy use on teenage versus adult brains and the added risks from laced street drugs. What does this really tell us about how we understand cannabis risks? And why is context, things like when someone starts using or where they get it from, so incredibly critical in any discussion about its effects and dangers?
Definitely a lot to think about there. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of Chapter 48. We hope it's provided a much richer understanding of the complexities Dr. Brandeis lays out.
And please do join us next time. We're continuing our journey through The 21st Century Man with Chapter 49. And building right off our mention of CBD today, that chapter's titled Health Benefits of CBD. We'll be diving into what the source material says about the potential therapeutic side of that non-psychoactive part of the cannabis plant.
Looking forward to that conversation. Hope you can join us.
Thanks for listening.